we'll be taking a deep dive into how much it actually costs to make your alcohol from home. Let's start with the cheapest option, which is cider. And why cider? Because you can make it with apple juice instead of using real apples. You don't have to go apple picking, buy a big bunch of apples, blend them. You can get cheap apple juice. However, you want to make sure that the apple juice you buy is tasty and that it tastes good, because the taste of your juice will determine the taste of your homebrew. And I've noticed this because I've used Great Value apple juice from Walmart, and I've also used No Name apple juice from Loblaws, and these juice are not created the same. I prefer personally the No Name brand from Loblaws, and these cost $1.79 for 2 liters. And we'll need 3 liters, therefore, instead of buying 1.5, we have to go with 2. Therefore, it's 1.79 times 2. And that purchase is necessary because we cannot make cider without apple juice. Another item that's absolutely necessary for home brewing is the fermentation jar. And let's say you're not handy, you don't want to make this on your own, and you want to buy just one good jar from Amazon. It costs $26.28. And now all the other things, you can either find it in your pantry or your homebrew experience can work without it. It won't be optimal, however, it's not necessary. Let's talk about sugar. We do need to add sugar. This is a must in your homebrew because we cannot just transform your apple juice into alcohol since there's not enough sugar inside the juice. And I would hope you have sugar somewhere in your house, or if your neighbor has any, you can borrow 3 cups of sugar. If not, you can go to the store, and this is $2.99 for 1 kilogram of sugar. I also add 1 teaspoon of molasses, and a box of molasses is $4.29. We will need yeast. This yeast is a must. When you're making alcohol, you can use baker's yeast if you bake and you have this yeast ready in your pantry. However, if you want to make sure that your alcohol tastes good, I would suggest for wine and champagne, I would suggest EC 1118 yeast, and this costs $13.99 for a 10-pack. If you want to measure how much alcohol you've made, because you want to know if you're going to get drunk in 5, 10, or 30 minutes, you're going to need a hydrometer and a cylinder, and this is going to determine the percentage of alcohol, whether it's 5%, 10%, 15% alcohol, and a hydrometer costs $12.50, and the cylinder is $11.99 on Amazon. Then you're gonna have to think about the stove that you use, whether it's electricity or gas, because you will be using a pot for this, and you'll need to warm your liquid. And we shouldn't forget the pots and pans. If ever you don't have any more pots, you just moved in a new house, you can buy a new pot for $19.99, and a ladle or a big spoon, $7.78. When you're warming your alcohol, you want to make sure that it's not too hot, because once it's too hot, it kills the yeast, and the yeast start dying at 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
And if your yeast dies, you can always pitch in new yeast, or you can always reuse old yeast. And how do people reuse old yeast? They take yeast that has been used for home brewing a different batch, and once they extract it from the liquid, they'll add it to this current liquid. So let me know in the comments below if you've reused yeast in the past, and if so, is this something you would recommend? And when it comes to buying yeast, you have the option to buy the EC 1118 yeast, which is made for champagne and wine. The EC 1118 comes in packs of 10, and it's $13.99. If you're making beer, there's always beer yeast, and you can always use bread yeast if you're out of other home brewing yeast and that's the only thing you have left in your pantry. And for my 5-liter batches, I use 1 teaspoon of yeast.
And you have the option to eyeball your ingredients or to really go by the book. And if you want to go by the book and you have no cups or no teaspoons, you can buy these equipment, and a set of cups would be $4.99, and for teaspoons it would cost $8.99. Making cider at the cheapest, meaning with apple juice and a fermentation jar that you do not have to create by putting holes in a balloon. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about one jar that you buy from Amazon and apple juice that you can buy at a low price. It'll cost $29.86. And this is for 1 gallon or 5 liters. And if you want to purchase the other equipment to make sure that you know how much alcohol you're making, if you ran out of sugar, if you have no pots and pans, this can go all the way up to $136. And just to note that this $136 is not applicable for only one use, but you will reuse your fermentation jar, you will reuse your pots and your ladle, and your measuring cups, your hydrometer, your thermometer, everything is reusable. The only thing that you can only use once is the apple juice. Therefore, you have to buy that every time. And eventually you'll run out of sugar in your pantry, so you can spend a little more on sugar. But typically, the amount of alcohol that you make is more than a bottle or more than a can for cider. Therefore, if one can of cider is roughly 750 milliliters and you're making 5 liters, it's roughly 5 times the amount of your regular purchase at the bar. That's cider, which is our cheapest option. Another option that we have is red wine. And red wine, it really took me a long time to master this recipe. And the secret is to get red juice that is bitter and sour, because red wine is not sweet. Red wine typically has bitterness, has tannins, and has this sort of texture to its taste. And what I use is organic cranberry juice, and these are expensive. So I buy 2 bottles and I use 1.5 jars of cranberry juice. So one bottle is $12.05. And this is an expensive jar of juice. And every time I make red wine, I need 2 of these. I also need sugar, and all the other equipment is the same as cider. So the main difference between wine and cider is the juice. For cider, I'm using apple juice, and for red wine, I'm using organic cranberry juice. Why organic, you may ask? It's because there are no preservatives in organic cranberry juice. Contrarily to regular cranberry juice, you'll usually find sulfites, citric acid, or other preservatives that inhibit the yeast from making alcohol. In apple juice, they have 2 preservatives that are okay for the yeast that still let the yeast eat the sugar, and these are malic acid and ascorbic acid. So it's fine. If your juice has malic acid and ascorbic acid, is no problem for the yeast. For the wine, we had 2 bottles of cranberry juice, and all the other equipment is the same. Therefore, fermentation jar, which you can reuse, 4 cups of white sugar, a hydrometer, a cylinder, stove heating depending on if you're using gas or electricity, a thermometer for temperature purposes, cups and teaspoon measurements, and a pot and ladle, which you can reuse. You can make your alcohol in the same pot as you've cook your food in. And now for the most complicated, in my opinion, the most complicated alcohol to make is beer, when I'm comparing it to cider and wine. Why beer? Because you can either use the grains. However, grains could be heavy. You have to carry this whole bag and make sure that the grains are ready for the home brew. Or if you want to simplify your homebrew process, you can use liquid or dry malt extract. Here I'm all about helping you save costs. And what I would suggest is using a liquid malt extract because it is slightly cheaper than the dry malt extract. But first, the first thing we need for beer to give it that beer taste is a bag of hops. And hops are expensive. For 1 pound, I found some at $39. Therefore, let's say you're not sure of making beer yet, you're just experimenting, dabbling in the idea, you can start by purchasing 1 ounce of hops for $12.99. And I know earlier we're talking about grains and liquid malt extract. However, if you do not have these, do not fret. You can always use sugar for your beer instead. You do not have to use malt. This is because the malt replaces the sugar. It's what is eaten by the yeast. And all the other ingredients are the same. 1 teaspoon of molasses, yeast. However, if you do not want to use the baker's yeast, there's beer yeast instead of champagne or wine yeast in this case. And beer yeast, I found a cheaper one. It's a big cylinder and it's $19 for 454 grams. Usually I would go with the little packages of ale yeast, which have worked well. However, I'm experimenting this new yeast and I'll let you know if it tastes like beer. However, if there's hops, then it's most likely going to taste like beer. Going back to the other purchases, fermentation jar with airlock, which is the same. You'll need a hydrometer and a cylinder. And for the stove, whether it's gas or electric, this time you'll have to spend a little bit more when making beer because unlike wine and cider, you have to boil beer. For wine and cider, the goal is not to boil it. You just want to make sure it's warm to an optimal temperature for yeast. However, for beer, you have to make sure it boils, make sure it cools down, and make sure it boils again because we're adding hops. Hops, by the way, are little green pellets that come from a plant. And for the beer, we're also going to need an optional thermometer and pots and a ladle. So the range for beer goes from $39.27 at the cheapest to the most expensive, which would cost $151.45. And this amount, once again, you can use it for multiple home brews, not just one. Especially when you buy a big bag of hops, I only use 2 to 4 hops per home brew. Therefore, you can use these hops for a really long time. And you can replace the malt with sugar. Therefore, you can save costs and use sugar, which is cheaper than liquid or dry malt extract. And the range for a red wine is $50.38, and it can go all the way up to $152.23, which can be used through multiple winemaking processes. And if you want tips and tricks on how to make your different types of alcohol, book a class. The link is in the description below. And if you found this video valuable, share with a friend, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.